All right, well, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here this afternoon. My name is Tony Wayne, and this is the formal launch of our new series at SIS Ambassadors Up Close. The idea of this series is to invite a number of different ambassadors, but also senior policy makers from the US and from other countries to come to SIS and to talk about important issues, to have the opportunity to have an exchange with the SIS community, SIS students, and to really just have another way of engaging with those who are out making decisions, trying to influence policy in different ways, just as many of our colleagues here at SIS do also. So it's my great pleasure to have a number of former colleagues with us today. In fact, I was calculating, we certainly have 200 years worth of foreign policy experience in this room, even though nobody wants to admit it. And I would say at least 250 if we have all the people who worked on this report, which you're going to learn about today. So there's a lot of great foreign policy expertise, people who've served around the world, who've served in different specialties within the State Department, and they put that all together in this report on where should we be going with the U.S. Foreign Service, U.S. Diplomatic Corps, State Department. A lot of people, these colleagues and others, started thinking about this more seriously during the last administration, when the last administration was not treating the State Department or the Foreign Service in what many of us considered a generous or constructive way. And part of that initial effort was just trying to make sure we could maintain as a country a diplomatic corps, a foreign ministry that was still capable, that we could maintain these relationships. But what this period of concern did was it got everybody to think about the things that needed to be improved in our own service, in our own department, in the way we conducted foreign policy, that we conceived of it. And so my colleagues here today actually went to work to try to work through what the key issues were. They came out with an initial report sponsored in part by the Harvard Belfer Center early on 2020, and then decided to have a phase 2 of that report, which you're going to hear about today. And I think it's really interesting for anybody who, if you're thinking of perhaps working in the U.S. State Department and Foreign Service, but also if you're thinking about interacting, if you're from another country, and how will the United States interact with your country and others on important policy issues. So I'd like to start off by asking Ambassador Marc Grossman to give a few remarks, putting this project in context. Ambassador Grossman and I have worked together for many, many years, over the years, in many different situations, some funny and some less funny, but always good and constructive. And Ambassador Grossman has been working in a number of different positions. I worked with him when he was Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, then Undersecretary for Political Affairs, and then happily when he was called back in to the State Department to be Special Representative for Afghanistan, and I happened to be serving in Afghanistan at that time. So he's done many other things too. But one of the important ones right now is how he's been contributing to this project. So Marc, please.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me without this mic?
Yes.
Yes, great.
But they're doing the recording.
Oh, so I'm stuck.
Yeah.
I have no choice.
Is that on now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Tony, first of all, thank you very much. And thank you all for taking time out of your afternoon here to come and visit with us. We've been working hard on this project, and we've been working even harder to try to bring it to people who we hope will have some effect on it, and it will have some effect on them. First of all, I want to thank Tony for all of his kindness, and to thank American University for offering us this opportunity. Tony's really talked a little bit about kind of how we got to where we got. I just wanted to make maybe 5 or 6 minutes of comments to sort of bring you up to date, so you know where we landed. And then I'll ask my co-chair, Marcie Ries, to talk a little bit about what's next. And then we brought some of the authors of our chapters with us. So they'll talk to you a little bit as well. And then we're glad to take anybody's comments and questions. As Tony said, we started this project early, actually in 2018, a number of us. Thought about it in 2019, had a fantastic plan for going forward. We were supported by the Una Chapman Cox Foundation. Joellen Powell is the executive director of that foundation, and Harvard University, the Belfer Center. And originally there were 4 of us, Marcie and myself, and Nancy McEldowney, and also Ambassador Nick Burns, who was working at Harvard at the time. Harvard was a great partner, really helped us do what we needed to get done. And of course, we had this wonderful plan at the end of 2019 about how we were going to go all across the country, meet a lot of people. COVID came, we had to change our plan, but we worked our way through 2019, looking toward putting out a report. And we got through 2019, 2020 with Harvard's help. And as Tony said, we issued a report on what it would take to have a new modern American diplomacy. And to put that report together, we spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people. We had workshops, and because of Zoom, we had them all across the country. We met with all kinds of people, foreign service officers who were serving, civil service people who were serving, people who were retired military, retired intelligence people, all kinds of different people. We talked to hundreds of people. And we also tried to reach out to the public as best we could through the World Affairs Councils of America. And we owe them a great debt as well. And Marcie and I spoke to a number of World Affairs Councils to get their input about what an American diplomacy should be about. That report had 10 recommendations. All of them we still support, all of them we think are good, but we listened carefully to people after we put the report out. And Nick Burns, as you know, went to be the ambassador to China. Nancy McEldowney went to be the vice president's national security advisor. And Marcie and I said to ourselves, we're just can't let this sit, right? We just can't let this be. And we want to try to take it now to one more round. But we wanted to do something that nobody had ever done before. And that was to try to take some recommendations, and we'll tell you about the 4 that we made, take some of these recommendations and actually get somebody to write the legislation that it would take to implement those regulations or those recommendations, or to have the regulation language that you would need, or the executive order that you would need to actually get these things done. Because as you all know from studying foreign policy and the State Department, what happens is people have great ideas. They leave a report on your desk and they say, here's our idea. I hope you can implement this thing. And we said, no, we wanted to do something different. And so you'll find if you look at the report, all 4 of the recommendations have with them the language that would be required to move them forward. When we put together that second idea, luckily for us, the Cox Foundation was again very enthusiastic about supporting it. Harvard University, less so because Nick Burns had moved on, but luckily Arizona State University and Mike Poltz, Ambassador Mike Poltz, came, and they were our new institutional home. They did a fantastic job, wonderful, with all kinds of support, student support, fellowships, all kinds of things to help us get this job done. And so we rolled this out a couple of months ago. So far, so good has been the reaction. I was noticing today that in the Foreign Service Journal, which is the State Department, kind of the people who work at the State Department, the American Foreign Service Association, their journal, we had a very nice editorial from the State Department representative saying, this is good, let's try to implement it. So we're on an effort now to try to get this thing implemented, and we'll see. And Marcie will tell you a little bit more about that.
Okay, so actually, Ambassador Wayne here has a copy of the report, which is called Blueprints for a More Modern Foreign Service. And as Marc mentioned, what we were thinking about was something that somebody could take and really have in their hands exactly what they would need to implement our ideas. So when you think about how would you implement change in the State Department and especially in the Foreign Service? Well, it will take a lot of different people to do that. It might take, in some instances, the the administration, the White House, the State Department, in other instances, the Congress, because what governs what we have now, the Foreign Service, is the Foreign Service Act of 1980, 40 years old. So some amendment to that might be necessary, but we thought we also need the public. We need people to know who we are, what the Foreign Service is, and to support the idea that the United States needs to put more resources, more thought, and try to modernize what we have as our implementing body for foreign policy, which is the Foreign Service. So here's our report in hand. And what happens next? Well, what happens next is that we have to persuade people that we're right. And we have to give them the tools to implement the report. So that is where we are now. And again, fortunately, the Cox Foundation is staying with us, and Arizona State and the American Academy of Diplomacy. So working together, we're hoping to go forward and get people interested. Let me say one other thing, and that is that the jumping off point for the whole project was the idea that things had really changed from the point of view of the practice of diplomacy. In the years after 9/11, we were really all very focused on counterterrorism and in some cases actual wars. But there's a general sense now, and I think it's right, that the focus needs to be on diplomacy, and that competition in the world, both functional competition, new ways of thinking about things, AI, cyber, and all of those things, we need to be dealt with, not to mention new frontiers like space and the Arctic. The other day I read that somebody's thinking about sending an ambassador to the Arctic. So we'll see where they present their credentials. So to the bottom line here is that we need the best possible diplomacy that we can manage. And one of the ways we think we ought to get that is by looking at 4 different aspects of the way that we conduct diplomacy and the way the Foreign Service is organized, trained, deployed, used, and equipped. So we're going to talk about the specifics, and I'm going to leave it to our authors to focus on that. So thank you very much for coming. We're really happy to have you all here. Joelle. Yeah.
Hey, my turn.
You want to do yours? Yeah.
Hi, afternoon, everybody. Just before I launch in on my particular section of the blueprints, which was reforms to the human resources systems of the State Department, let me say what a real joy it is to have the luxury of being able to work with so many people who care so much about this institution that we grew up in many ways, the Foreign Service. To have the time and the knowledge to be able to think about how to make it better, more effective, more representative of the United States is an amazing, amazing experience. My piece of this blueprint, these roadmaps, is focused on how we can make the human resources systems, the personnel systems of the State Department better reflect the diversity of backgrounds, skills, new skill sets that we need, skills that have been treasured and prized in foreign services for as long as diplomatic corps have existed, language skills, regional expertise, multilateral expertise, how to recruit better, how to get at audiences, potential audiences that we've not reached before because there has always been a ready supply of people from schools like SIS ready to fill that pipeline, but perhaps sometimes we need to go beyond that to look at emerging specialties, space, cybersecurity, water, food, how to manage hunger. I mean, these are all things that diplomats have to deal with every day. I wanted to look for a little bit at how we take care of our families, because we, the Foreign Service, are a family, and we all have our own families, and they follow us around the world and put up with an awful lot. I can vouch for that. So looking at family issues was one of the things that we wanted to look at. How do we recruit? How do we train? How do we build in professional development to what is a very competitive career? We compete for promotion, we compete for assignments, we compete with each other every year. And so how can we do a better job of this? How can we be forward focused instead of sort of relying on the way we've always done things? And it really boiled down at the end to several sets of blueprints. First of all, recruitment. We need to recruit more broadly. So one set of blueprints looks at how we might, what it would cost, and how we might get some expertise to help us widen our recruitment effort. How to get beyond the I-95 corridor, as it were, or the two coasts, become more attractive to people who might not otherwise ever hear about or think about the Foreign Service and the conduct of diplomacy. One of the blueprints looks at training and professional development. And here I think the military served not as a model exactly, but as an inspiration, because one of my personal favorite secretaries of state, no relation, Colin Powell, he was a military man, and he understood the value of regularly going back and doing professional development as part of your career from day one all the way through to 4-star general. So my HR blueprints fit very carefully in with a whole separate section on training and professional development. How do we build a training complement? How can we ensure that people are able to take time away from that job in Baghdad, or the Baghdad job doesn't have to sit empty because somebody is still in training? How do we staff for that? How do we ensure that training becomes an integral part of a career path? And it needs to be that way. So big part of that blueprint is looking at staffing, looking at a continuous process of looking at where we are, where are the gaps? So people call it gap analysis, so whatever you want to call it. Where are we having friction points? Where are we having a hard time filling positions? And how often is training being sacrificed to meet short-term urgent needs, whether it's pulling people out of training to get to post, or pulling people away from something else that they had planned to do because we need to staff up a new task force, or endless list of demands on diplomats' times. So looking at growing the size of the Foreign Service to accommodate this, to build in time for training, and to make sure that we're not shortchanging our posts overseas is an important part of this blueprint. When we do get people into the service, we bring them in as entry-level officers, and we have a training complement. That's terrific. That's all well and good, but we have to make sure that we have the right kinds of jobs overseas, and that we're taking care of our missions overseas, and that when we send officers overseas for the first time, or even the second time, that they have supervisors at post that know what the job is, that can help train them, that can help guide them, that can help support them and mentor them. So looking at where our positions are and how we can ensure that people entering the Foreign Service in whatever specialty are set up for success and not set up for failure. We took a hard look at language capability, because there are some languages that the State Department will invest up to 2 years teaching you. And that's a lot of investment, but super hard languages: Chinese, Arabic, Korean, Japanese. These require a big investment, and the department would like to see a better return on that investment. Building language expertise, being able to use it in more than one assignment, and being able to develop regional or functional expertise, terribly important. So we propose some incentives to encourage people not only to take that language, but then to re-up for a second assignment and to continue to maintain language proficiency, not just use it and then lose it. We looked at the question of the professional foreign service and the different functions and the different skills that people need to be successful leaders, to be successful ambassadors, assistant secretaries, chiefs of mission. What does it take to be really good at this? And so we wanted to make sure that we had the right blend of experiences or opportunities for officers at entry levels and at mid levels to gain both policy, substantive experience, but operational experience, functionality, supervising people, managing resources, making decisions. All of these are aspects of leadership that are critically important as one rises through the ranks. And to the extent that we can enable officers to have some experience in both operational and policy functions, this is a good thing. So we looked at that, and that was another blueprint. And the last set of blueprints had to do with families. Families have always been an important part of the Foreign Service, but I dare say that in the last 20 years, the whole concept of working spouses and working couples has changed radically. People come into the Foreign Service as spouses with careers of their own, and they'd like to be able to maintain those careers, or they come in and would like to work and are not currently in a career of their own. So making opportunities available for family members is something that we thought was very important. And that is a piece that actually is more than a culture change. That one does take some legislation. The Department of Defense has a very good model, and basically what we are proposing is to emulate that model as much as possible. The last thing I would say is that the career Foreign Service is important, and it should be in leadership positions in the department. The blueprints recommend, and I couldn't endorse this more strongly, that there are positions that should be filled by Foreign Service officers, full stop, at the undersecretary level. The undersecretaries for political affairs and for management should be career officers with the right background and the right experience, in recognition of the fact that the Secretary of State, quite correctly, will be in all probability not a former career officer of the Foreign Service. Looking at the balance of career and non-career ambassadors and assistant secretaries, we think it's important that opportunities to serve in senior leadership positions be available to the Foreign Service, and that the Foreign Service has unique expertise that it can bring. So, in a long nutshell, that's the HR recommendations.
One of the things that I think has changed in the time that I've been in the service, and going back a little farther than that, is one had big crises. The Korean War, World War II, maybe the Gulf oil crisis or something like that. What we've seen over time is that the number of crises have grown, and they are taking place simultaneously. Now, and the size of the State Department is relatively stagnant. Getting the size of the State Department up is a difficult activity with the Congress, and usually fails. The U.S. military has figured out how to do it. There is the regular military. the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Marines, Space Force now, Coast Guard. But there are the reserve components of all those elements. And then there is the National Guard, which can be federalized and called into service. And they represent a surge capability. So when you're facing more than one crisis at the moment, you can bring forward whatever you need in the military sense from the reserves or from the National Guard, push those individuals forward, individuals who are already trained in the specific skill sets that are going to be needed for that. So you might mobilize a reserve unit from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and a National Guard unit from Tennessee. Why? Because you're dealing with a particular problem, and the skill sets, the MOS, the military occupation set, is the right for that. So my assignment, I sat down and took the Foreign Service Act and all the modus vivendi of that, and then went to, I think it was Section E of Title 10, which is the portion of the United States law, U.S. Code, that governs the Reserve and National Guard components of the military services, and then figured out how to cross-rough them into what hopefully was a seamless one. And with the greatest assent from something Marc mentioned, we found a absolutely brilliant retired employee of the United States Congress who spent 20 years writing legislation. So I laid out, in effect, the piece parts that we could have this, we could have that, and we could have the other. And then what he did was to bring them together into the legislative package that you can see when you do this. Now, how does this work? We figure we have to start small, so we start in a 4-year program to reach a certain level. We need to do a couple of things. You first have to define what your needs are. So the program requires going to all the assistant secretaries of state and their equivalents, which are the operating chiefs of the department, and say, I want you to look now, and I want you to try to look over the horizon and tell me if you are faced with multiple crises, if you are required to surge in your part of the world or with your specialty, economics, science, the Arctic, what would you need that you don't have in your bureau or entity right now? And so asking them to define what they need and then have a board composed of the undersecretaries, that's the tier 3 of the department, to weigh and measure all those guesses into packages for the first year, the second year, the third year, and the fourth year of this effort. And so we're going to need so many people who can work on the Arctic, so many people who could worry about global warming. If you have, the terrible crisis, for example, that's now going on in Ethiopia, and they do come to some kind of peace agreement or at least ceasefire between Eritrea and Ethiopia, what the U.S. State Department would need to surge in. So what are the skill sets? And then there's the question is, how in the world do you find those skill sets? The State Department has all of 10 recruiters distributed around the United States. That's 10, 2 handsful. That is simply incapable of this kind of outreach. But what the State Department does have are thousands of people who are still sentient and who are retired in almost every zip code throughout the United States. However, we really have no legal way to hire those retirees to get them to do this kind of work without cutting their pension. Now, who wants me to offer you $1 and then take $1 away from your pension? Maybe you've got a good heart, you're willing to work for free. That's not what most people want. So the idea is then to get, and it's in the legislation, congressional authority, that we would be able to compensate retirees from around the country who would take on the responsibility of going to colleges and universities, going to military bases and talking to people who are about to leave the military service and have some of those skill sets we're looking for. They may decide to join the reserves of the National Guard, but they may decide they'd like to join the Diplomatic Reserve Corps of the State Department. And so, then there's a lot of other verbiage in there, as Marc pointed out, which is very important. You have to make sure you've touched all the bases. How do we compensate these individuals? What pay system do we use? For those people who are not already retired and graduated with an international degree and are now working for a law firm in Dubuque, Iowa, but who would like to contribute something and has that right skill set, can we offer them some kind of a pension? What about healthcare? What about if we're going to send them overseas for 2 years because there's an ongoing crisis? Can he or she take their family with them? All those pieces are brought together in a concept, a diplomatic reserve corps. It will have the skill sets that are projected, have a way to compensate, a way to recruit, a way to maintain going forward. Lastly, we put in one more piece, and that is every 4 years or so, we would require all those assistant secretaries to pause and go back and review the horizon one more time, and 8 years out and 12 years out, and see if the skill sets that they projected then are still the ones they're going to need, because the reserve would be recruited just like the U.S. military reserve is. They would have a tour. We put down 4 years. You're in the Diplomatic Reserve Corps for 4 years. If we want you and you want to stay, we keep you. If your skill set is no longer needed, you're retired with a small remuneration and the nation's thanks. So we think this is the way we have to go, because the State Department, as presently constituted, simply does not have the wherewithal to deal with the volumetric problems that are facing us on a worldwide basis.
And you want to just talk about the number of people
Oh.
after 4 years?
It's 3,000. 3,000. We start out, it's with 750 the first year, 750, 750, 750. It's based on an effective 5-year plan. Year 0, we bring this all together. We get the legislation, get the funding. You have to have the money to start with, and you make sure that the people in diplomatic security, our law enforcement division, can get these people the security clearances they need. We can get them through the medical division. And then we start and we staff up the National Foreign Affairs Training Center, the Foreign Service Institute, because there is a training complement to this that I should have mentioned as well. We treat this just like the military, 1 weekend a month plus 2 weeks a year. And now, how are we going to do this when you have the entire country? We can't bring these people to Washington, all 3,000 of them every month. But we've learned with Zoom and other techniques that we could do training. The Foreign Service Institute did an incredible job of retargeting during the COVID situation. And we're doing everything from language training to functional specialization training, and spent a lot of time talking to the chief trainer and their technology people. So we start out 750, get up, and then for year 6, we figure some people are going to think, oh, well, I like the idea, but this is too much of a burden on my family, or it wasn't what we thought it would be. So we continue the recruiting process, the onboarding process, the training process. In terms of training, I said we would reach out to the people on the weekends, get them up to speed, bring them to Washington. That first year, get them understanding how Washington is, probably bring them back to Washington the second year and put them into the bureau, the State Department operating entity, where their specialty is. Year 3, ship them overseas, spend 2 weeks at an embassy so they can see how their function, their specialty plays in a different environment. and year 4 probably just keep sending them back to various embassies, both to excuse me, assist the embassies, but also to build up their understanding of what it's like to operate on the ground, where you're having to deal not with just with other Americans, but with the host nation's foreign ministry or economic ministry, as well as dealing with allies such as the British, the French, the Japanese, the United Nations system.
All right. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. So education and training. So the State Department does have an entire school for education and training called the Foreign Service Institute, and it's very good. They offer hundreds of courses, a lot focused on language training, virtually all the language you could possibly imagine. Area studies, and then functional training aimed at specific jobs and skill sets. So what are we looking to change or improve? What we were looking at was to give all of our officers a program of career-long training, not just, I'm gonna have this job where that it requires me to know something about artificial intelligence and science, so I'll take a 2-week course in that. No, what we were thinking of is something like the military has, where as you move up in the Foreign Service, there are specific blocks of training that you would get. And what would we hope to accomplish? We would hope that people would get not only the skills and training for that particular job, but that they would do a lot with strategic thinking, with current events, and with current problems facing the country, that they would have a chance to really do some in-depth study, regional study, or perhaps even more language training than the standard level that we're expected to reach for a particular assignment. And then, as Joellen was mentioning, they would then take more than one assignment using that language. And finally, we were looking to combine both functional training and leadership and management at different levels. We offer leadership and management training now, but it's very specifically pointed at, 2 weeks of training if you're going to be a supervisor, or 2 weeks of training if you're going to be the number 2 in an embassy, the all important deputy chief of mission. So the idea of this approach was to assemble a set of levels that every Foreign Service officer would go through, so that they would acquire all of these skills, at various different levels. And I won't go through all the detail here, but at the last level would be a course similar to what the military has, a capstone course, where they would look at the strategic implications of particular crises and regional circumstances at the very highest level. In order to accomplish this, of course, this is a pretty ambitious program. There are 2 problems we have to deal with. One is culture, and the other is just logistics. The State Department doesn't have enough people to have people in training at all of these levels at the same time. We end up with vacant positions while the other person is away in training. And of course, that engenders an attitude of, if I'm the supervisor, do I encourage this guy to go to training? No, because if the person leaves, nobody's going to fill that position. And the next guy is going to have to do 2 jobs instead of just their own. So the State Department has already started down this path. They have about 4% of what we would call a training complement. The military, we at first, when we thought about this, took the figure 15%, because that's the way the military calculates. They have to have 15% more people at any one time, so that the ones who are in training, there's a backfill. So for the State Department, we decided that 8% was probably appropriate. And what we're thinking of is that you could do this you could bring in enough additional people if you started this program in about 4 years. But the other side of it is we have a little bit in our culture that puts the emphasis on doing that hard job as opposed to going off and taking training and improving your mind. And that really has to change. So one way we thought of changing it was, number one, giving people, serious grades or some kind of quantitative evaluation. And secondly, rewarding them, that making it a point that when the panel that assigns the really good jobs is thinking about it, they look at what kind of training this person has and how they did in that training. And I should say that in all of this project, in all of the pieces, we thought about how the culture would have to change. You have to have a modern culture to go with a modern foreign service. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I'll do the last one of the chapters, and then we'll look forward to Charlie Ray making some final comments, and then to your comments and questions. So let me just talk a little bit about the chapter called Mission and Mandate. The Mission and Mandate chapter was done by Ambassador Mike Polt, who turns out also to be the representative of Arizona State University here. So we were able to tie that back. He was also assisted by a very good focus group from the American Foreign Service Association, and we thank them very much for that. So the Mission and Mandate chapter was trying to find out sort of what's the State Department supposed to do? What do the American people expect from the people who are their diplomats? And Marcie said in the beginning of her remarks was that what we were looking for was to try to say that the American people deserve the best possible diplomatic service that we can make, right? The best people in it, with the best mission, with the best desires, with the best effort that they're trying to make. And so the whole rest of the report is designed to create this high-functioning, kind of world-leading piece of diplomacy. And so the first few paragraphs of this Mission and Mandate chapter are about a world-class, high-functioning diplomacy for the American people. And then what we did was we took 4 or 5 specific areas where we thought it might be useful to think again about what the mission and the mandate of the Foreign Service and the State Department is. One was to think about the question of standards. And here you heard a couple of times about some high-level jobs around the State Department are filled by career people, right? Foreign service people, civil service people, career folks in the government, but some are filled by political appointees. And one of the things we argued was they all ought to have the same standards. We're not against political appointees. We don't think the number of political appointees in the State Department should be 0. But if people are going to come and bring us expertise from the outside, they then ought to live up to the same standards that career people do, and make that one of the most important changes in mission and mandate. Secondly, and perhaps you all have studied this in your classes here, I know Ambassador Wayne talks about it. One of the great things about being an ambassador to the United States of America is you have a letter from the President of the United States. And that letter comes to you and it says, you, with a couple of exceptions, you are responsible for everything that the executive branch is doing in the country to which you are assigned or the international organization that you're working for. It's a good letter. But we thought in terms of a modern letter, we ought to try to rewrite it so that these modern questions that all of my colleagues have been talking about are also there, that the Chief of Missions Authority is really clear that she or he has got this responsibility for moving American foreign policy forward. And so we thought, well, let's not just say we'd like to do these things, let's rewrite the letter. And so if you take a look at the report, you'll see a few pages of a new draft letter from the President of the United States to Chiefs of Mission. One of the most important set of paragraphs in that letter, and the next piece of the mission and mandate chapter, was the whole question of risk, right? So we send people abroad, and then sometimes we send them abroad to dangerous places, and then we put them in big embassies that are fortresses, essentially. And then we say, you're assigned here overseas, do a really good job, but you can't leave, right? Or it's really hard for you to receive people from the host country to the embassy. And we had this kind of idea that it was time to talk a little bit more about kind of risk management instead of risk avoidance. And here we were lucky. We were able to support an effort that the American Academy of Diplomacy is making with the Congress to change the way that people are judged on risk management. They're called accountability review boards, right? Something terrible happens, an accountability review board is established, and right now the idea is find fault. Now, finding fault's important, but if that's the only thing you do, what does it lead to? It leads to risk avoidance and not to risk management. So a very important part of this chapter and an important part of the letter is thinking again about the question of risk management as opposed to risk avoidance, because our view is that the people of the United States will understand and expect that diplomacy is a dangerous thing, right? And that people are going to get hurt. And that you can't avoid that 100% of the time. You need to make the right decisions, but the idea is that people should be involved with their host country and knowing people and meeting people. And then finally, there's the connection of, there was the idea of better connecting with the American people. And this flows through the report. So one of our ideas in the Diplomatic Reserve Corps was, what will these people who come to Washington for a couple of weeks a year, who spend 4 years as reservists, what will they be? They'll be ambassadors, we hope, of the State Department back in their home communities. So when people say, so what's it like? We want these people to say, well, the people who work at the State Department, Foreign Service and Civil Service, they're patriotic people. They are supporting the government. They're supporting us, right? The citizens of the United States. So it's in the Diplomatic Reserve Corps. It's in training as well. And one of the things we've said is that people ought to go outside of the kind of normal set of universities, and I include this one, SIS at AU, but to go outside of our geography to get a master's degree, right? To do some additional study. And that's a way also to diversify the connection. And then the specific recommendation in the mission and mandate chapter was for people who are back from their assignments abroad on home leave, not should just be kind of encouraged, but really, really encouraged and compensated to go out to communities around the United States of America and talk about what it's like to be a diplomat. And their family should go with them because, as Ambassador Powell said, as Joe Allen said, families play a really important role in this, and they have their stories to tell as well. And so we designed a kind of enhanced hometown diplomat program so that more and more people have the opportunity to get connected to communities around the United States. So we thought at the end, kind of this mission and mandate chapter, I would really kind of speak to some of the themes in this whole report, right? Which is that among the reasons we did this report was to honor the people who are serving today, right? To do something for them. And also mission and mandate has inside it another very important thought, which was none of the things that we've been talking about, none of the things in the 4 chapters should be a gift to the Foreign Service, right? So you deserve this, please have this. That all these things need to be earned. And so, more professional education, more people, a diplomatic reserve corps, more people from the Foreign Service and the Civil Service in policy-making positions, those things have to be earned. And mission and mandate is one of the core ways that they can be back to being earned. So I'd ask Ambassador Ray to wrap up, and then we'll take your questions and comments.
Thank you. As Executive Director of the American Diplomacy Project Phase 2, I'd like to underscore something that Ambassador Grossman said at the start, and that is that this was something that has never been done before, which is why if you look at the report, or if you look at this document, you will see that nowhere on the cover does the word report appear, because it's in fact not a report. We've used that term, but it's a set of blueprints. It's plans ready to implement. And not only do we have the legislative language, but we also have time schedules and projected budgets, so that in fact, the people who have the authority to do this need only take a look, make a few cosmetic changes here and there, and they can send these out the door. And that was our objective, was to provide blueprints that can be implemented with basically minimum sweat. And another sort of thing I'd like to point out is that we did not try to do everything in this report. The phase 1 which I was one of the hundreds of people that they talked to during phase one, had 10 recommendations. When we set out to do phase two, we looked at what's actually achievable. We came up with 4 sets of areas that blueprints could be done for. But if you look at them carefully, you will see a lot of the other 6 recommendations folded into this. And it was an ambitious project, but I think we all agree as we worked on this over a 9-month, 10-month period, that there is nothing in it that can't be done if people are willing to try. And we hope that you, as part of the American public, will add your voices to the chorus that says, let's do it. And now, if you have questions, we'll be happy to take them.
Invite everybody to come up here, please, Pat. Whoever wants to ask a question.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Todd Wiggins. I have a question. It's sort of general. It sounds like almost like a recruitment process, right? So it's a campaign to not only attract good people, but then assign them to various places. So you're sort of all HR people acting in a sense right now. So what sort of screening mechanisms would you apply to this? And is drug testing a part of that? Character, work habits, background, all those kinds of things apply?
To answer your question, we have not proposed in these blueprints changing the current intake process. We've proposed broadening the aperture, if you will, but the process of intake right now exists of the Foreign Service written test, the Foreign Service Officer test, which if one is successful, one does 2 things. An oral assessment and a qualifications evaluation process, or I'm not sure what the P stands for, QEP, which looks at your professional background, your persona, in addition to an all-day oral assessment. People who are successful on that must be able to get a medical clearance to serve, to be what we call worldwide available. That has changed somewhat over time with advances in the medical profession and in distance care. So what was might have been a medical condition that would prohibit entry into the Foreign Service in an earlier era, such as being HIV positive, is now no longer an issue. But you still have to get a medical clearance and you have to be able to serve overseas. You have to be able to get a security clearance, and the Bureau of Diplomatic Security is the final arbiter of that. Random drug testing is absolutely a part of the Foreign Service. Any of us, and the Civil Service, it's the whole Department of State, anybody government-wide that has a security clearance is subject to random drug testing at any time. I will never forget the day when I was acting Director General, and I got a call to present myself to the Commerce Department within 45 minutes, which I did. So, yeah, then once you're in the Foreign Service, you are brought in the Foreign Service anyway, on a limited non-career appointment. You have 5 years in which to earn something which we call tenure, meaning you are now appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, into the Foreign Service. But your first appointment is conditional on up to 5 years of successful performance. In the Civil Service, that career conditional appointment is for a 3-year period. Does that help answer the question? Okay, terrific.
Can I just add one, oh, Pat, if you let me.
One thing on the rules about security clearances, including drug testing, are not the State Department rules. These are national rules proclaimed by the Director of National Intelligence that says you must have this, and this, and you can't have that, and that in order to receive a top secret security clearance. They're in the process now of dealing with marijuana use previously In the past, that was a problem. My reading of and talking to a few people is that they're moving away from that. If you took a few tokes in undergraduate and were not a continuing user, and we will, that would be ignored. I think Avril Haines, who's the D&I director, and her team will probably come to that conclusion. That's a guesstimate, but I think the government realized that there is a change in society and we've got to hold, because if you have access to all this classified information, you better not, have moments where you're just not in control of yourself.
Can I just mention to that, you just addressed exactly what I was, because the marijuana laws are changing across the country.
And that is being reviewed at the national level, because each agency does not invent its own rules. There's rules for top secret, secret, confidential, and something called public trust.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm Shannon Hayter. I'm your dean here at SIS. So I wanted to thank you all for being here. And I tell you, I would want to sit down and talk for about 10 hours on all this. So thank you for all your work. It's very exciting. I think it is so exciting and it's so well presented that if you haven't necessarily spent a few years in an embassy or in Washington here at the State Department, it seems like, all these recommendations are such no-brainers. But in reality, I know they're very controversial, some of them. So could you pick a few things to highlight for our crowd here about things that perhaps are the hottest button issues or controversial, or things that you think might be the heaviest lift to get the kind of investment and legislation that you need? Thanks.
Well, Dean, thank you very much for the question. I'd say that we tried to get the most controversial things kind of out of the way in the first report. So, for example, in the 10 recommendations in the first report, one of them was a complete overhaul of the 1980 Foreign Service Act, right? Well, we knew this was going to be really controversial, and it was, but it started the conversation we wanted. And so what you've seen on my colleagues have said, there's plenty of change to the 1980 Foreign Service Act in this report. But if you ask us, did you get rid of the 1980 Act and start over? No, we didn't do that, right? Another very controversial recommendation we made in the first report was for a mid-level entry program into the State Department. And this also turned out to be, and we knew, wildly controversial. But what do you know? A little bit like Pat's comment about drugs, this is coming. And it turns out that maybe the American Foreign Service Association, for example, is going to have this as a recommendation. So, leave this to them. There were a number of others. In this report, I'd say that the controversies really have to do, as you said at the end of your question, about money. Right. So can we convince people that this is worth spending money on? So the 8% increase in the service to get enough people for training, professional education, it would cost us a couple $100 million, $220 million over 4 years. The Diplomatic Reserve Corps is a ramp up of money and $45 million then into the years ahead. So I know in some budgets, that's not very much money, but at the State Department, it's a substantial sum of money. And so that I think will be controversial. Other things that so far, in the training, professional education, I think in terms of our community at large, things have been pretty well received. I'd say two other things. One is in the point that Ambassador Ray made. There is controversy over what we didn't try to deal with, right? So, for example, we didn't really try to take on the problems, and there are enormous challenges in the civil service, right? What we hoped to be was an inspiration to people to deal with that problem. We didn't deal very much with the Foreign Service. There are foreign services at the Commerce Department, right? In AID. Here, their agriculture, right? So there are things that we didn't do, and there are people who thought we should have done more. Okay, that's life. So and then the other thing is, and this goes back to the previous question as well. The other question is diversity, right? And, the State Department needs just to do more. In the first report, we said we need a relentless focus on diversity. We tried to put that into every one of the chapters. And I hope that will also be something that people will take seriously. I don't know if anybody else.
Hi, my name is Eric Darija. I'm a junior here at SIS. This is more of a comment, something to consider rather than a question. So the State Department has been labeled notoriously bureaucratic. In this blueprint and the recommendations you're submitting, how are you planning on creating a more, as Ambassador Grossman mentioned, a high functioning, high performance, world leading institution that can resolve crises rapidly with all these recommendations you're proposing? And just a quick thank you also for caring so much about American diplomacy and taking the time to really research this, issues that are inhibiting maybe some areas of the State Department's work and trying to improve them. Thank you very much.
Is this working? Yes, good. Well, to be honest, we didn't attack the problem of how the Department of State is organized and how business is conducted. Instead, we decided to approach the problem from the point of view of the people, of the Foreign Service itself, with the idea that if you gave our people more opportunities to grow and learn and experience and to take risk and to think about things strategically, that our diplomacy would be strengthened as a consequence. So you're quite right that there are lots of things to consider about the way the organization operates. It's too hierarchical, it's too bureaucratic. You have to get 40 people to say yes to if you want to send a paper to the secretary. And there are many problems like that, which we just couldn't touch upon in this project. But you're right that those things need attention.
If I could add,
Could I just, to sort of put what Marcie just said very eloquently into very simple terms. We didn't try to build a better bureaucracy. We didn't even try to change the bureaucracy. We tried to inject things into the leadership culture and as she said, focus on the individuals rather than the bureaucratic structure and let the individuals be the agents of the necessary change.
I think from the management side, and I'm a management type, as was my colleague here, these policy people, they don't know what they're doing. But there is a separate problem that leads to a huge chunk of bureaucracy, and that is huge micromanagement from the General Accounting Office, from the Congress, and from the Inspection Corps. The inspection corps that have been created statutorily at any government agency have developed an incredible gotcha mentality, which is, well, we got to prove our worth. That's the IG. Got to prove our worth. Therefore, I've got to catch so many malefactors. And it doesn't matter if you forgot to check box 3 on form 579 or whether you stole $1 million. It's point scoring by the IG, and that's going to have to be addressed someday, because it really, really causes those who have to manage to tighten up and to get super bureaucratic, because it becomes self-preservation. That's wrong. That's never would happen in a business organization, but it's certainly happening in the federal government now.
We can go. That's an extra long time.
I'm Josiah Gottfried. I'm a first-year graduate student at SIS. I thought your proposals were they seemed common sense. And part of that was the analogies that you made frequently to the armed forces and how the armed forces have a reserve and how they have a training float. But I was wondering if you have considered any other countries' diplomatic services and if they have implemented any of your recommendations and how that's turned out.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go first? Yeah.
Okay. Woven into the HR section are some pieces of analysis that I found when I was actually working on another project looking at multilateral diplomacy and how other countries do multilateral diplomacy. And so I looked at several different diplomatic corps, including the UK, France, Germany, some of the Nordics, Japan. And although I never did succeed in talking directly to anybody representing the Chinese diplomatic service, I looked at what I could on them as well. And I think the biggest difference between our fundamental structure and that of most other diplomatic services is that most other diplomatic services, including most of the Western European ones, hive out altogether the consular functions and to a great degree the management functions from their core diplomatic service. So structurally, I think we are actually the better one by including consular functions, including management functions in our diplomatic service. A little sidebar, Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic and Consular Relations actually award lower levels of protections to consular officials than they do to diplomatic officials. So, it is in our interest as a nation, I believe, that we have the broadest mandate with the best protections possible. So I think we're actually better off in terms of our core structure than many other diplomatic services. A couple of things that did come out to me that I think others are doing that we have recommended here. The French in particular have a very good program of structured regular intervals of leadership and executive training, similar to what we are proposing here. Training in a lot of the other diplomatic services, sadly, is more ad hoc in nature.
I was just going to say one other thing which we learned. There is, by the way, a book, a very interesting book that was written by two professors who attempted to gather information about all the diplomatic services in the world. But I must say that some services are rather secretive and don't engage in conversation about how they train their diplomats or how they structure their diplomatic service. But one thing that we noticed with respect to intake and training is that a lot of services are structured to take people directly out of school and then put them, the Greeks do this, put them into an entire year of training before they get to do anything. In fact, I think before they're really fully accepted into the service. So our average entering age is 32. So that means that the people that we are taking in, for the most part, have done something else before they come in, and many have graduate degrees. So that dictates a different approach to education and training. So that means that, for example, our entry training is not going to be 12 months long.
Thank you.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank you for this extraordinary panel. And I am Mohammed bin Hamdan. I am LLM graduate from LLM graduate in International Legal Studies. And by the way, I'm from Yemen. So, and I think all of us, like, that the war in Yemen is still going on, and it also has left the worst humanitarian and economic condition in the world. And my question is, as a modern diplomacy, what the United States should take to enforce Houthis exhibit the extension of the truce, and this is also is apply for any armed groups if they don't want to exhibit any negotiation or mediation agreement. So what we can to enforce these people end the war and go to the negotiation table. especially when some armed groups, they don't believe in diplomacy, or they just see the United States as the evil, and they don't want to consider anything for like the people and the future. So thank you so much.
Sorry, you should say.
Yeah.
Happy tried to.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much. And yes, first of all, I think I speak on all of us here, all of our behalfs, and to say that what's happened in Yemen is, as you just said, an enormous political tragedy, but an enormous human tragedy. And I think one of the things that I think people who study diplomacy, as you all are studying diplomacy, will recognize is it's very hard to keep people's attention on any one thing for very long. All right. And so I think one of the challenges of what's happened since the 24th of February, when Putin invaded Ukraine, or all the things that happen in the world, is that human tragedies, enormous tragedies, catastrophes like Yemen, they're not on the front page anymore. And that's one of the jobs of diplomats, I think, is to try to keep these kinds of questions in front of the public. So that's thing number one. Second thing is, the idea that you try to bring people together to end these wars is, I think, the most fundamental job of diplomats. People say, why did you go into diplomacy? Well, I went into diplomacy not to represent the United States, to protect and defend America's national interests. And what's one of the best ways to do that, right, is to try to bring people who are in conflict with one another to some kind of peaceful resolution. And I would imagine that every single person on this panel, and Ambassador Wayne and other people in this room, have tried to do just that. And so that's the job, right? The question then is, for Yemen, for example, what tools would you use now to get this job done? One of the challenges is the one that you raised, right? Which is that the parties, maybe they don't trust the United States. So somebody else has to do this work, right? But the United States may want to support that. It's why, as all of us here, I think, have had some experience with multilateral institutions, with the United Nations, right, or the African Union. And those are very important organizations in these kinds of efforts. But I think that, again, last point is that this can be done. I mean, if you think over the last couple of days, surprising to me, right, in Ethiopia, there seems to be now some conversation between the parties. I think that the bit of diplomacy that was done last month, I think, between Israel and Lebanon to finally sort of figure out a little bit about their sea border, right, to at least lower tensions there a little bit, something positive, a piece of diplomacy. And, one of the things that I think that, final point for me, one of the things that people think about diplomats is that people think that diplomats are pessimists. And I think the best diplomats actually are optimists, because why else would you get up every morning and try to solve some of these problems? And so that's the job, right? It's the job to get this done.
Yeah, we ask ourselves that question
Every day.
but we still get up and go do it.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Crown Princess Merman. Say my husband. Crown Princess Mayala Mukodem bint Abdallah bint Abdulaziz Al Saud. And I am part of the Saudi Arabian government. And I'm the first female deputy crown or deputy prime minister. And it is very hard. So I'm actually really appreciative to be here today, because you guys have inspired me so much. And how do you get this copy of this book? How do you get the copy of this book? But my question is, from a female standpoint, now that we're able to engage in such a high level with diplomacy, okay, and I'm running into a lot of roadblocks when it comes to assisting with Yemen, or the situation with the United States and my own country. And it's very hard to get everybody to be almost on the same page, okay? And in your book, the blueprint of what I've skimmed through so far, I don't have it myself, but it seems to have a lot of guidance as to how to really maneuver between these policies and diplomacy and legislative attributes, if you want to say. So from you guys' entire course of your careers, what would you recommend to young upcoming representations of different countries or even the United States as to maneuvering in these different galleries of policy and diplomacy and legislative actions in order for us to be able to help to address situations on a better apparatus. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So thank you very much for this question. And yes, you can you can download the report, and we're happy to have you read it electronically. It saves trees, but it's quite pretty. So what I might say as a woman diplomat, that, well, first of all, diplomacy is about relations between people. It's true that we're talking about relations between states and in some cases, international organizations and so on. But the practice of diplomacy is between people. It's about talking, about negotiating, about understanding, about trust. And these are things that I think, if you excuse me for saying so, women are very good at some of these things and maybe take a little bit different approach. I would say that it's very important to focus on that. And the kinds of skills that we're talking about are important for our diplomats, are important for diplomacy anywhere. And what we're talking about here is strategic thinking, engaging with others, managing the risk of getting out of your embassy and going to see people. I've been in situations where that involved riding in an armored vehicle many times. Actually, in my last couple of jobs, I had a security detail around me all the time. And that can be an impediment in some respects, although you're very grateful for people who are willing to risk themselves for you. That can be an impediment to direct communication. But I think that's the way we need to focus, is that this profession can involve a lot of academic work and knowledge of management techniques and so on. But it is, at the end of the day, about people, about negotiating, about working out arrangements, about understanding that there are some greater principles involved in what we are all doing.
To which, if I could say, don't feel like you have to be the first one to speak. Don't be afraid to ask questions, because sometimes people think if they ask questions, then they will not be perceived as the smartest person in the room. But asking questions and understanding where somebody else is coming from is a critical point in negotiating. And if you can be patient, diplomacy is a patient art. If you can be patient and you can listen to people and you can begin to understand what the real rubbing points are, then I think you can learn how to be effective, because you can learn what is critical to them and what is critical to you.
Hi, my name is Owen Wells. Good afternoon. Thank you again for your time. So also for a current master's student, aspiring FSO. So one policy recommendation that I'd also love, in addition to the recommendations that are here today, if the State Department could bring back the Diplomacy Fellows Program again, I would personally love that. But as for my question, so I remember reading through the blueprint about, I can't remember the exact section, but bringing up the necessity for teaching diplomatic history, or making sure diplomatic history is like a better requirement for entry-level diplomats. I just was wondering if you could like talk more to that, speak more to that. For example, would someone who is stationed in Guatemala, would they be asked to learn more about previous policy, like the CIA abetting the coup in Guatemala, for example?
I would say that what we were thinking was that kind of what struck us is that Americans writ large don't know very much about their diplomatic history. And it turns out that American diplomats don't know very much about their diplomatic history. And so it wouldn't necessarily be, the overthrow of the Arbenz regime in Guatemala. It would be that Benjamin Franklin was America's first great diplomat, that diplomacy played an enormously important part in our winning our revolution, that there is a diplomatic history of the United States of America on which we stand. And so I think that's what we were trying to get at, that when you take the oath of office, I took my oath of office in March of 1976. I put my hand up and I became an American diplomat. Someone said, terrific, now go to Pakistan, be an American diplomat. But what does that mean, right? And on whose shoulders was I standing? And not just the previous kind of generation, but all the way back to the founders of the Republic. And so I think what we were trying to convey was that you should know this history because we should be proud of it, right? And so, if you think about our military colleagues, or you think about any sports team, or you think about American University, right? You say that you're part of a chain that goes back some way. And you're not here, you're not isolated, you didn't just think this up, and that you should be proud of the people who went before you. And that's what we wanted to convey, that we stand on the shoulders of 250 years of American diplomacy.
This will be our last question.
Hi, my name is Layla. I can meet you. I'm a junior studying peace and conflict in the Horn of Africa. And my question was about how your blueprints will impact the United States' role or influence in international institutions, like the UN, the World Bank, et cetera.
How will the blueprint affect or have an impact on U.S. role and participation in international institutions? I certainly hope it will make us better and more effective, because a couple of the things that we have looked at in these blueprints include building either regional or multilateral expertise, and that accompanied with having that depth of knowledge, not just about what in the multilateral forum, for example, not just what the pull and push points are on the particular regional issue, but how to get a multilateral body to do your will, how to persuade them over to your team. I think if the United States has the right representation in the right places in multilateral organizations through the kind of training, the kind of professional development, the kind of assignments to multilateral organizations that are perceived as not only career enhancing, but fun and rewarding, then if we can get more engaged across the spectrum of seniority, not just putting in ambassadors to the UN like my lovely friend Linda Thomas Greenfield, but at working levels. If we can start to pull that in earlier on, I think we will become much more effective.
Another thing too is that, you've heard it said, diplomacy is the art of developing relationships. Developing good relationships means having credibility with the people with whom you're trying to build a relationship. And to build on what Ambassador Grossman said about understanding our diplomatic history, when we send people into an international institution and they're interacting with people who know more about us than we know about us, we have zero credibility. I mean, when I'm talking to someone who can tell me more about the fact that we as a country appointed our first ambassador 70 plus years after we became a country. How many Americans know that? Yeah. How many Americans know that the first Secretary of State didn't even want to have diplomats? He just wanted commercial consuls. In fact, how many people know who our first Secretary of State even was? I doubt if anyone here could answer that question. Thank you. Well, you surprised me. This is the first time that's happened. But the point is, when you're sitting in an international institution and you're dealing with people and you're trying to build your credibility to compete evenly with them, and they can tell you more about your country than you can tell them about your country. And our blueprints, if implemented, address some of that. As I said, in this, we're not trying to build a different or even better bureaucracy. We're trying to build better leadership within that organization so that it can compete effectively with anyone, anywhere, at any time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
And Ambassador Powell was too humble to say that she also did a report on U.S. multilateral diplomacy. And you can talk to her, but you can also do a Google search. Look up Joellen Powell, and it was a very good report with a number of recommendations. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to thank our guests for their wonderful presentation and the great work that they're still doing. And we're going to watch now, see these pieces of legislation emerge. And we know they're going to work hard on it. So thank you all very much.